whose ancestors were the first to walk the land on which the nation's capital now stands. With this 7th edition of the findings of Census 2021, Stats Canada continues to tell the story of Canadians. This release will focus on education, work, commuting, language of work, and minority official language education. Today, we'll be presenting an overview of the main results of this release. The presentation will be made in both official languages. To start, we'll be looking at Canada's place among G7 countries when it comes to college and university graduates. We'll also look at the evolution of educational attainment since the last census, and the overqualification rate of immigrants with a foreign bachelor's degree or higher. We will also be looking at trends among apprenticeship certificate holders who have a certificate from one of 3 broad trades, and employment rates by educational attainment during the pandemic. At the time of the 2021 census, Canada was first among G7 countries in terms of the percentage of working-age people, so those aged between 25 and 64 years of age, with a college or university degree. So the rate was 57.5%. Canada has maintained this top ranking since 2006, and this is due in part to the strength of our college education system. Nearly a quarter of Canadians have a college certificate, diploma, or similar academic credential as their highest level of education. This is higher than in any other G7 country and more than double the proportion in the United States. Not only does the strength of the college sector play an important role in the country's high international ranking, but the number of Canadians with a bachelor's degree or higher is also increasing. About a third of working-age Canadians had at least a bachelor's degree or higher. That's an increase of 4.3 percentage points from 2016 to 2021. And that's a faster increase than was observed in previous census cycles, where the increase was just under 3%. The increase over 2016 represents an additional 1 million working-age people with a bachelor's degree or higher. And nearly half of this increase was attributable to recent immigrants, so those who immigrated to this country since the 2016 census. The number of recent immigrants was the highest ever recorded in a Canadian census. These immigrants, who arrived in Canada between 2016 and 2021, were more highly educated than those from any previous immigrant cohort. So nearly 6 out of 10 of them had a bachelor's degree or higher.
Although the most recent cohort of immigrants is highly educated and has seen improving labor market outcomes, not all immigrants are finding jobs that fit their educational attainment, particularly those with foreign degrees. Foreign degrees are not always recognized as equivalent in Canada, so immigrants with them are twice as likely to be overqualified as Canadian-born or Canadian-educated degree holders. Over a quarter of immigrants with foreign degrees were overqualified. This overqualification and job mismatch exist even in fields such as healthcare, where labor demand is extremely high. For example, only 36.5% of immigrants with a foreign bachelor's degree or higher in registered nursing worked as a registered nurse or in closely related occupations, while 41.1% of immigrants with a foreign medical degree worked as a doctor. While the number of working-age people with degrees was increasing from 2016 to 2021, the number of working-age people with an apprenticeship certificate in key trades fields stayed level or declined in the same period. These key fields of construction, mechanic and repair technologies, and precision production made about 70% of apprenticeship certificates and are fields where there is an aging workforce. Although young people are entering construction trades, the total number of people aged 25 to 64 who had an apprenticeship in construction only increased slightly by 0.6 percentage point, by 0.6% from 2016 to 2021, because the number of young entrants was only enough to replace the number of baby boomers who are retiring. Young people were less likely than the baby boomers to have an apprenticeship certificate in mechanic and repair technologies or precision production, and this, combined with the aging of the baby boomers, caused a decrease in the number of people with apprenticeship certificates in those trades. We know that those with post-secondary credentials generally have higher employment rates and earnings, and those without them, and that higher levels of education provide greater economic security. This was evident during the pandemic as people with lower levels of education face greater declines in employment. Workers with a bachelor's degree are higher at greater job security during the pandemic, partly because they were more likely to be in triple protected jobs that are permanent, cannot easily be automated, and are more pandemic resilient, being either suitable for remote work, compatible with social distancing, or deemed essential by authorities. According to previous Statistics Canada research, more than 7 in 10 workers with a credential above the bachelor's degree level and more than 6 in 10 with a bachelor's degree were in triple protected jobs, compared with fewer than 4 in 10 for those with any other level of education. Today's results from the 2021 census provide new, detailed insights into the Canadian labor force. And today, we are looking at the jobs that Canadians are doing and some of the fastest growing occupations, the impact of population aging on the labor supply of tomorrow, and some of the interesting differences we see in labor market conditions in local communities across Canada. Depuis le début du 21e siècle, la croissance de
From the
l'emploi
beginning of the
national au Québec
21st
fut observée dans
century,
trois secteurs:
we've seen a lot of growth in three key sectors: construction, healthcare, as well as professional, scientific, and technical services. This represents more than half of the growth.
The census provides detailed information about the types of jobs these people do. In construction, most of the 1.3 million people employed were men at 86.3%, and most were working as laborers and in skilled trades. Women in the industry were mainly in administrative roles. The number of people working in healthcare continued to rise as needs for an aging population were exacerbated by the pandemic. Nearly 1/3 of all health occupations are held by Canadians in racialized populations, higher than the overall proportion of employment. Nearly 1 in 4 general practitioners and family physicians were Chinese, Arab, or South Asian Canadians. Dans les services professionnels scientifiques,
In professional, scientific, and technical services, the number of workers grew by nearly 1.5 million, exceeding the growth rate of all other industries between the most recent 2016 and 2021 censuses.
This industry includes web designers and developers, human resources professionals, accountants, as well as lawyers. Emerging occupation in this industry included data scientists and cybersecurity specialists. Le taux global d'activité a diminué à chaque recensement.
The overall labor force participation rate has declined in every census since 2006 due to the aging of the baby boomer generation. This trend continued between 2016 and 2021, with the rate declining from 65.2% to 63.7%.
Since the previous census, more than 1.4 million Canadians entered the ranks of those aged 55 and older. Participation rate across older age groups increased, but not nearly enough to offset the large downward pressure from population aging. The overall participation rate is projected to continue to decrease until at least 2036, based on all sets of assumptions about future immigration levels. Bien que l'immigration ne puisse pas compenser entièrement,
While immigration can't fully compensate for the effects of an aging population, it is an important source of talent for Canada's labor force.
In 2021, immigrants accounted for the largest share of the population since Confederation and comprised more than 1/4 of the core age labor force. In Toronto and Vancouver, immigrants made up about half of the core age labor force. Les immigrants récents ont généralement des taux de chômage plus
Recent immigrants in the prime working age group have lower unemployment rates compared to earlier cohorts, and this was still the case in 2021.
In 2021, the unemployment rate of recent core age immigrants was 10.9%, similar to what it was in 2016. At the same time, the rate for virtually all other groups increased over that period. As a result, the gap between recent immigrants and non-immigrants shrunk from 5 percentage points in 2016 to 3.2 percentage points in 2021. Despite some mismatches in skills and occupations, recent immigrants were more likely to work in industries with above average hourly wages compared with previous census years, such as professional, scientific, and technical services. Part of this improvement in labor market outcomes is related to recent immigrants having higher levels of education. In addition, a greater share came to Canada temporarily prior to seeking permanent residency. Les membres des groupes racisés font face à de nombreuses
Members of racialized groups face many barriers to equity in the labor force, and labor force participation of racialized groups is generally lower than those of other groups.
To 2021, the participation rate increased on average for those in a racialized population group, while it declined slightly for the total core age population. The largest increase was among Korean and West Asian Canadians. The participation rate also increased for South Asian and Latin American Canadians, bringing the rate of both groups to a level similar to the overall rate. Filipino Canadians had the highest participation rates. In the census metropolitan areas of Toronto and Vancouver, more than half of the employed were members of a racialized group. In Toronto, the largest group was South Asian Canadians, and in Vancouver, it was Chinese Canadians. Le secteur des technologies d'information et des communications.
The information and communications technology sector is a grouping of industries that are critical to the growth of the digital economy, including computer systems design, software publishing, and the manufacture of semiconductors and other electronic components.
There were 673,000 Canadians working in this sector in 2021, representing 3.9% of total employment, more than agriculture and natural resources combined. Le secteur des technologies d'information.
The ICT sector plays a particularly important role in a number of local labor markets across Canada. Of the 10 North American technology hubs, 6 were in Canada. The top 2 in Canada were Toronto and Kitchener-Cambridge-Waterloo.
While immigrants play a key role in many industries, the global market for skills and talent is particularly notable for the information communication technology sector in Canada. Half of the growth in this sector from 2016 to 2021 was among immigrants. Today's release also presents a comprehensive portrait of commuting in Canada at the time of the 2021 census. Using the unique power of census data, today's release documents the impact of the pandemic on commuting at the national, provincial, territorial, and local levels, and it offers important new insights on what getting to work in May 2021 meant for diverse groups of Canadians. En mai 2021, au cours de la troisième vague de
In
la
May
pandémie,
2021, during the third wave of the pandemic, 4.2 million people, or 24.3% of workers, usually worked from home. This is compared to 1.3 million, or 7.4%, in May 2016.
From the labor force survey, we know that working at home hasn't shifted dramatically since May 2021. For example, in May 2022, 25% of Canadians were working exclusively or partially at home, a similar figure to May 2021. En octobre 2022, le passage en
By October 2022, as the shift to a hybrid work environment intensified, almost 25% of Canadians were still working from home most of the time.
As working at home increased, the number of commuters fell by 2.8 million from 2016 to 2021 and impacted all main modes of transportation to work: car, public transit, walking, and cycling. En mai 2021, le nombre de Canadiens
By May 2021, the number of Canadians who drove to work had decreased by 1.7 million from 2016 to almost 11 million.
Almost all of Canada's largest urban centers, our census metropolitan areas, saw fewer car commuters on the road. Ottawa-Gatineau had the largest proportional decline among the census metropolitan areas, followed by Toronto, Hamilton, and Kitchener-Cambridge-Waterloo. Car commuters spent on average 22.8 minutes getting to work in May 2021, down from 24.1 minutes in 2016. For those with a usual workplace, the average car commute was 21 minutes, and for those with no fixed workplace, like many in construction, regional sales, and transportation, car commuting took 30.7 minutes on average. However, as pandemic restrictions eased in 2022, the number of car commuters had exceeded May 2016 levels by May 2022, 12.8 million. Car commuting levels had approached or exceeded May 2016 levels in every province except Quebec. With the rebound in the number of car commuters, average car commuting times edged up from 22.8 minutes in 2021 to 23.5 minutes in May 2022, but remained below the 2016 levels. The number of Canadians usually traveling to work by bus, train, or subway fell by half, from 2 million in 2016 to 1 million in May 2021. All modes, bus, subway, light rail, train, streetcar, were affected. Public transit is predominantly found in large urban centers. Ottawa-Gatineau saw public transit commuting fall by more than 60%, followed by Toronto, Calgary, and Edmonton. Public transit for commuting to work is common among certain demographic groups, including youth, women, people in low income, members of racialized groups, and immigrants. For example, among racialized groups, the proportion of commuters who use public transit as their main mode of commuting in May 2021 ranged from 11.9% for Chinese Canadians to 22.7% for Black Canadians. Of the 1 million commuters who mainly use public transit to commute in 2021, 563,000 people, or almost 3 in 5, belonged to a racialized group. Racialized Canadians accounted for just over 1/4 of the population, of the employed population. In 2021, 13.1% of immigrants commuted by public transit, compared with 4.7% of Canadian-born individuals. In fact, 559,000 of the 1 million commuters who mainly used public transit to commute were immigrants or non-permanent residents, while they represented 27.8% of all commuters. There were some signs of recovery in public transit commuting as seen in the labor force survey for May 2022. The number of public transit commuters in the provinces was 177,000 higher than in May 2021, but was still down by 40% compared with May 2016. Le nombre de Canadiens qui se rendent au travail.
The number of Canadians who walk or bike to work has declined by more than a quarter, from 1.1 million in 2016 to 811,000 in 2021.
This decline in walking and biking to work reflects, in part, the fewer jobs in accommodation and food services and retail trade in 2021. In 2016, 1/3 of all Canadians who mainly commuted by foot or bicycle worked in accommodation and food services and retail trade. While walking to work is common in small towns across Canada, it is also popular among those living in downtown cores of Canada's largest cities. Ottawa, Gatineau, and Victoria have the highest proportions of downtown residents who walk to work. Looking at the May 2022 labor force survey, we see that both walking and cycling to work increased from May 2021, but overall remain below the 2016 levels. Je vais maintenant céder la parole à mon collègue Eric.
I'll now give the floor to my colleague, Eric.
Bonjour. Today's
Good morning.
Canada also releases information on language of work as well as language of instruction. Let's begin with language of work, which includes languages used regularly at work as well as languages used most often at work. While we reported an ever-increasing diversity in the languages spoken at home a few months ago, almost 99% of workers had either French or English as their most often language used at work. Overall in Canada, more than 3 in 4 workers used mainly English, and 1 in 5 used mainly French. English was used on a regular basis by more than 80% of workers, while 1 in 4 regularly used French at work. Among them, some were using both English and French. Of course, the results differ by province and region. Le français était la langue principale de travail de
4 out of 5 Quebec workers had French as their main language at work, and nearly 9 out of 10 regularly used French at work. So either they use that as their primary or secondary language. While almost 2/3 of Quebec residents use only French at work, more than a quarter used a combination of English and French. In total, just over 1/3 of workers regularly used English in Quebec, and it was the main language of work for 1 in 7 workers, so 14%. In order to reduce the response burden and improve data quality, the order of the questions on language of work was changed in 2021. Data on the language used most often at work or primarily at work can be compared with the data from previous censuses, considering the full distribution of single and multiple responses. However, data on other languages used regularly or languages spoken secondarily at work should not be compared. In Quebec, compared to 2016, the primary use of English at work was up to 14%. This increase is partly a result of the change in the questions on language at work. This change leads workers to less frequently report equal use of English and French and more frequently report primary use of only one of these languages. Correspondingly, the apparent stability in the rate of primary use of French should be interpreted more as a certain downward trend. In 2021, 79.9% of workers in Quebec used French as their main language. That said, in Quebec, there has been a relative decrease in the primary use of French, particularly in certain sectors, like the finance and insurance sector and the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. These fast-growing sectors were already among those with the lowest primary use of French back in 2016. In the Montreal metropolitan area, 70% of workers primarily used French at work, while 21% primarily used English. Among workers in the Montreal area who spoke a language other than French or English predominantly at home, half of them spoke French as their primary language at work, and just over 1/3 spoke English.
Among the workers living in New Brunswick, about 1 in 5 mainly used French at work, and three-quarters mainly used English. The proportion of those mainly using French decreased, continuing a trend observed since 2001. Among New Brunswickers who predominantly spoke French at home, 7 in 10 mainly used French at work. Among those who predominantly spoke English at home, almost all mainly use also that language, so English at work. Lastly, about among the about 1.2 million workers who knew French and were living in other provinces than Quebec and New Brunswick, 3 in 10, or about 400,000 people, regularly used French at work. Three-quarters were living in Ontario, and about a third lived in the Ottawa metropolitan area. Educational services and the federal public administration were the sectors that employed the largest number of workers who use French in provinces other than New Brunswick and Quebec. The languages other than French and English remain rarely used in the workplace, except in some regions. For instance, in Nunavut, more than 4 in 10 workers use Inuktitut regularly at work.
Today, we're also releasing the first information on language of instruction. Since 2021, the census has included new questions on language of instruction at the primary and secondary levels. These questions make it possible to count the number of children who are eligible for instruction in the minority official language according to 3 criteria under the Charter. Official language minority instruction is defined as instruction in French in Canada outside Quebec or instruction in English within Quebec. Nearly 1 in 8 children in Canada were eligible for elementary and secondary schooling in the minority official language. This includes over 300,000 children who were eligible for English language instruction in Quebec and close to 600,000 children who were eligible for French language instruction in Canada outside of Quebec. Out of these children, over 215,000 were under the age of 5, and 682,000 were aged between 5 and 17 years. So this generally corresponds to the ages when children attend primary or secondary school. The number and proportion of children under the age of 18 who are eligible for minority official language education are strongly related to the geographic distribution and the demographic weight of Francophone minority communities in Canada outside of Quebec or English-speaking communities within Quebec.
enfants admissibles à l'instruction dans la langue officielle minoritaire étaient les plus nombreux en Ontario.
And there were a number of children eligible for minority official language education within Ontario and Quebec, and they represent more than a third of the children in New Brunswick. Like the population of Canada, the vast majority of children eligible for official language minority education resided in the largest urban centers. In fact, almost half of the children eligible for official language minority education lived in major urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, or Ottawa-Gatineau. These three large urban centers each have over 100,000 eligible children. Now, the next largest urban centers were Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and Winnipeg, all in Western Canada. One of the main strengths of the census is that it provides population counts at the local level, such as municipalities. It is at this level that numbers are often considered when determining the need for educational services and schools. For example, the census found that in 2021, 135 municipalities had more than 1,000 children who were eligible for minority language education. The vast majority of these municipalities were in the country's major urban centers. More than two-thirds of school-age children eligible for minority official language instruction received instruction in that language during their school career or at the time of the census. The proportion was higher in New Brunswick, Quebec, the Yukon, and it was lower in BC, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Alberta. Several factors may account for the fact that some eligible children did not attend minority language education programs. These factors include parental choice and the distance from home to the nearest school, among others.
More than 90% of eligible children live within 15 kilometers of a minority official language school, both in Quebec and in Canada outside Quebec. Not surprisingly, the average distance between the place of residence and the closest minority official language schools is greater in rural areas than in urban areas. Actually, it's 4 times greater. The analysis showed that the further eligible school-age children live from a minority official language school, the less likely they are to have attended a minority official language school. This was observed in both rural and urban areas. Finally, the data released today provide a portrait of instruction in the minority official language in Canada, not only among children, but also among adults. Nearly 1 million people aged 5 years or older living in Quebec at the time of the 2021 census studied at an English primary or secondary school in Canada at one point in their life. Among persons in Canada outside Quebec aged 5 years or older, almost 1.2 million studied in a regular French program in a French language school, and another 1.6 million studied in a French immersion program, and 137,000 studied in both types of programs. Je redonne la parole maintenant à José.
I'll now give the floor back to José.
This concludes our discussions of the topics released today. For more information, a number of products are made available as part of the release: analytical products, various data products, and visualization tools and reference products.
We invite you to consult these products on our website.
In closing, I would like to remind you that today is the last major release of the results of the 2021 census. Stay tuned. Additional analysis, data tables, and microdata will be available over the next few months.
These products will offer a better portrait of Canada's current socioeconomic reality.
It can also be noted that the work around the 2026 census has started. Statistics Canada is currently preparing for public consultation regarding the 2026 2026 census content scheduled to start on January 9th, 2023. Invitations to participate will be emailed to individuals and organizations who are known census data users and for whom Statistics Canada has contact information. Statistics Canada will also reach out to the general public through its website, social media accounts, and regional offices. This public consultation will ask data users to provide informed feedback, about their census data uses, census data gaps, and alternative data sources. Please visit the 2026 Census of Population Content Consultation webpage for more information or email us if you would like to participate. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you for your attention, and we would be happy to answer your questions in the official language of your choice. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, on va passer à la période de
Thank you very much. So we'll take questions now.
for people on Zoom to use the raised hand function to indicate that you have a question, and I will unmute you. But we will start with questions in the room. A reminder, it's one question, one follow-up. Donc, c'est une question de suivi. Et on va commencer avec Valérie.
And we'll be starting with Valérie from Radio-Canada. Good morning. I have some questions about education and the language of instruction. So starting with the language of instruction, in Quebec there are 300,000 children who are eligible for English school. The majority of them, so 200,000, are in Montreal. Do you see that as a threat to the French language in the Montreal area? Good morning. Thank you for the question. Our role at Stats Canada is to provide factual information and a factual foundation for people who are involved in the education sector, for example. And the reason that we included those questions in the census was to help with planning school services, both in Quebec and outside of Quebec. So that's why this data, or questions about this data rather, were added to the census. If Stats Canada is broadcasting this data today, it's so that it can be used for planning purposes. Question. So if I've understood correctly, you would not want to speculate on the nature of... Answer, yes. Well, it's difficult for us to identify trends. This is only the first time that we've asked these questions on the 2021 census. There were questions on previous censuses about the number of people who were eligible for this, but this is the first substantive data that we have on it, and it will evolve over the coming years. And of course, any future data will be made available on this subject, notably the findings of the survey that we're currently conducting about official language minority communities. Question. Madame Desjardins, what is the impact of the gap between people who have a post-secondary degree and those who have a professional degree? It seems that one is going up while the other is going down. What impact will that have on Canadian society? Answer. Thank you for the question. I'll start, and then I'll give the floor over to my colleague Catherine to see if she has anything to add. In terms of what impact it will have, we look at the areas where we know that there is an aging population. So baby boomers who are preparing to retire, or, the fact that in some professions, it's very, very difficult to recruit students or new graduates, notably in construction. So it's not easy, or it's not easy to replace workers. And to really understand the dynamics of the labor market, of course, census data can be used, but we also have to look at the results of our survey on the labor force, which StatCan publishes every month, and to understand data about job vacancies, to understand which sectors and which professions are really suffering the worst from the labor shortage. Inès Lombardo from Franco Presse, please. Thank you for answering our questions today. Looking at the language of work across Canada, now I couldn't find the exact number of workers who speak French outside of Quebec. It seems like you excluded Quebec and New Brunswick, but do we have that number? Maybe I just missed it. Answer. So you're talking about the number of workers who use French outside of Quebec at work? Yes, outside of Quebec. Well, as I said in my notes, there are around 400,000 people outside of Quebec, so excluding New Brunswick and Quebec, who use French regularly at work. And the bulk of those were in Ontario and in the Ottawa area particularly. So did you include New Brunswick? No, so I'm saying if we don't count New Brunswick or Quebec. Okay, so there's not actually a number for Canada as a whole if we only exclude Quebec. Well, you could add the numbers from New Brunswick and the number I gave you. I can follow up with you after the conference if you like. Thank you, that would be appreciated. I don't have the number on the top of my head. Question. When it comes to official language minority instruction, I see that there are 292,000 children outside of Quebec who were eligible for instruction in an official minority language. That's higher in New Brunswick and in the Yukon. Does the census tell us why those numbers would be higher in those two jurisdictions? Or do we not know the answer to that? Answer. It has to do with the distribution, geographic distribution of Francophone speakers outside of Quebec. We know that in New Brunswick, the proportion of people who speak French at home or who can speak French is higher in the north and east of the province. So that's really linked to just what we see in the population. And the number of people who use French at home there is somewhat higher than the national average. This all comes from data from last August. And of course, the numbers are smaller in the Yukon in an absolute sense. So the geographic distribution is really what accounts for the different numbers that we see. And often these are people who have French-speaking parents, who speak French at home, and so on. Thank you very much. We'll now take questions from Zoom.
All the people connected to use the raised hand function to tell me you have a question. Alors, on va commencer avec Émilie Bergeron de la Presse canadienne.
We'll start with Émilie Bergeron.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Caron-Malenfant.
Yes, Mr. Caron-Malenfant. Earlier you said that we need to be careful about comparing the language of work. I had understood that in Quebec, the primary work language, if you look at that data, you can see that the use of French in the workplace has slightly gone down, and the use of English in the workplace has slightly gone up. Have I understood that correctly? And
que vous
if
avez
so,
la donnée là, de hausse de points de pourcentage de 2016 à
do you have the
2021
percentage
avec
change
l'usage
from
de
2016
l'anglais?
to 2021? Answer.
Oui, absolument. En fait, ce qu'on observe
Yeah,
pour,
absolutely.
dans
So, what
l'ensemble du
we've
Québec,
seen across
l'usage
Quebec
utilisé le
when it
plus
comes
souvent
to
au
the
travail, donc la
language that is most often used at work,
la proportion qui utilisait
we've
le
seen
français
that the
de façon
proportion of people
principale
using
au
French
Québec était de
primarily
80% en
was
2016 et 79,9%
80%
en
in 2016 and 79.9%
Pour ce qui est de
in
l'anglais,
2021.
c'était de 12%
For
en
English, it
2016
was
et
12% in
14%
2016 and 14%
en
in
2021.
2021.
Et puis, ce qu'on dit effectivement
So,
dans
what we
le
do
document
say in our
qui accompagne notre
analysis document that comes along with
c'est
today's
il est
release
possible
is that it is
que
possible
la tendance qu'on voit pour le français
that
au Québec,
the
étant donné le
this
changement
trend
ça semble être une relative stabilité. En fait, ça masque peut-être une baisse,
might be real. You know, there's an apparent stability, but I think there is also a small decline in the use of French. The thing is, there were people who used to say, oh, they use both French and English. And this time around, they were more likely to say that they used either one language or the other. And that's also why there is this slight increase in the use of English. And of course, for people who speak both English and French, equally, you know, that's a fairly small percentage of the population. But we do have to factor them in as well in our calculations.
OK, donc il faut en tenir compte,
Question.
Mais on peut quand même parler d'une légère baisse
So we can say that there has been a small decline in the primary use of French in the workplace in Quebec.
Corrigez-moi si je me trompe, mais ma question, j'avais besoin d'un point de clarification.
I might need a clarification
Dans
here.
les publications qui accompagnent, là, qui ont été publiées ce matin, on dit
In the
aussi que
documents
des
you've released this
secteurs
morning,
plus touchés, par
it
exemple
says that some
l'industrie de
sectors are more heavily
l'information et
affected,
l'industrie
like
culturelle,
the IT
qui
sector,
ont
the
eu
cultural
une
sector.
baisse d'usage du français
They've experienced a
beaucoup plus
decline,
marquée.
a more marked
Qu'est-ce
decline in the
que
use of French.
qu'est-ce que ça peut vouloir dire, là, l'industrie de l'information et l'industrie culturelle?
So what does that mean for those
Autant
sectors?
que Statistique Canada l'utilise. Je vais juste donner des exemples concrets. Là.
I'm just wondering if you can give us any concrete examples. Answer. Thank you. So to your first point, when it comes to interpreting the trends in Quebec, we did note that this relative stability might actually mask a slight decline in the primary use of French in the workplace. In terms of specific concrete examples of how this affects different sectors, I mean, if you look at IT or the cultural sector, I think I'll actually hand it over to my colleague to give you more details on that.
Could you give a few examples of the information and culture industry in terms of occupations?
So it was both for information and culture. So part of that is IT, but it can also be like information technology, but also anything to do with providing, anything. I can't think of any good cultural.
That would be
examples.
museums, right?
Yes, for sure, museums and anything to do with some things that are tourism related in Canada.
If I may, the question was specifically, I believe, about the use of French as a first language in Quebec, and she mentioned it was in the information and cultural sector, so she was maybe referring to that particularly. I don't know if you have any examples. What are we talking about exactly? Nothing else to add?
So we gave those examples
Okay.
for those two industries.
So museums.
Sorry to interrupt. I just when you don't speak directly in the mic, I don't quite hear well. I think you mentioned museums and IT. That's what I heard. Is that correct?
So for information, you can think of any occupations related to IT. And then for cultural, it would be any occupations related to, you could think of museum, concerts, anything that is related to entertainment would be considered in the culture industry.
Okay, merci.
Where we're going to go to Nuju Del Males, Canadian Press.
Hi there. My first question is about the report on the labor force. And it notes that the gap in the unemployment rates between recent immigrants and other workers has narrowed over the last 5 years. I'm just wondering what kind of warnings you'd give in terms of the conclusions people may draw from this. Specifically, I'm wondering whether differences in the profiles of these two groups may be contributing to the narrowing of the gap rather than maybe policy that would help recent immigrants find work. How do you suggest people interpret or navigate this finding?
So thank you for the question. As we stated earlier, for Statistics Canada is really to provide a portrait of, in this case, of the Canadian labor force in May 2021. So we can't really speak in terms of policy impact or, what should be the next step. However, what we know, and as we've said, is that if you look also at the numbers from our education release, we know that recent immigrants are more educated than previous cohorts of immigrants. And we know that the fact that they are more educated has an impact in terms of the labor market outcomes. And we also know that this difference could be explained by the fact that they may have come to Canada earlier and have work experience in Canada, as well as maybe have been part of international students program. So that would have helped in terms of their labor market outcome as well in Canada.
Thank you for that. And then
Oh, sorry, we're just going to repeat in French really quickly. Sorry about that.
Oui,
Nuju.
absolument. Alors, ce que j'ai expliqué, c'est que
So what I was saying is that Statistics Canada's role is really to give a portrait with the census of 2021. We're not really able to speculate on what the data means for different programs or policies or the impact that particular policies would have. When it comes to recent immigrants, we know that they often are more highly educated than previous cohorts of immigrants. And education levels do have an impact on their success in the labor force. That would be our first observation. Second observation would be that it's possible they have a greater experience, greater work experience. So if recent immigrants really came to work, or if they're international students, all of that could have an impact in terms of labor force gains.
thank you. And the follow-up question is from a colleague of mine. It's about the minority language education data. Seems to be the first time data has been collected. What does it tell us that we didn't know before?
Thank you for your question. Actually, the information that we have today is information that has been collected through new questions on the language of instruction. of the population. So we ask the persons if they went into, if they were schooled at the primary and secondary level in the provinces in Canada outside of Quebec, and if for those who live in Quebec, if they were schooled in English. So with this new information, we're able to have more to provide numbers of children who are eligible to instruction in the official language minority according to the criteria of the Charter of Freedoms. The Charter criteria include not only the mother tongue of the parents as a criteria for them to be able to send their children to the school in French outside of Quebec, but it includes also it requires also or there's criteria that are related to their instruction, the language of instruction, and the language of instruction also of their children. So with these new questions, we're able to have account with these criteria of children eligible in the official minority language. And with the questions also, we're able to have the number of children. So among them, what is the percentage who already, among those who are eligible, who already attended an official minority language school. We're able to know also for the overall population who were schooled actually, because we asked the question to everyone in the minority official language. And the main reason why the information was added was to plan, to help and to give a factual basis for planning of educational services, schools in the minority official languages across Canada. So in French in Canada outside Quebec, and in English in Quebec.
Prochaine question, Pascal Vachon, TFO.
Next question from
Oui,
Pascal
bonjour.
Vachon,
J'aimerais
TFO.
juste faire du pouce sur
Hey, good
la
morning.
question de ma collègue
I'd
Émilie
like
sur
to
la langue
follow
de
up
travail.
on my
Quand on
colleague's
regarde,
question about language
notamment
of
le
work.
graphique 1,
If I look
M.
at
Caron-Malenfant nous dit
graphic
que
1,
le nombre de
Mr.
gens en 2016
Caron-Malenfant,
qui ont répondu français et anglais a baissé
you said
et
that the
qu'en
number of people
2021,
who
il y a plus de
answered
gens qui vont répondre français
French
principalement
and
ou anglais
English actually
principalement ou une
declined,
autre langue.
and that
Mais quand on
in the most
regarde
recent survey,
je pourrais
it's
dire
more likely
français
that
et
people
anglais
answered one language or the
à
other.
égalité a baissé
But it
par
actually
rapport
looks
à
like the number of
2016
people who
2021, on
cited
remarque
both
que les
languages
données chez les anglophones,
declined.
par exemple, augmentent plus, puis ça descend chez les francophones. Alors, est-ce que c'est
So
juste quand
I'm
même
just
de dire que
wondering,
ça a baissé, sachant
is it
que
fair to
ça
say that this number
semble
has
avoir que la
declined,
majorité des
knowing that
réponses de 2016 à
it looks
2021
like
sont
most
passées vers
of the
l'anglais plutôt que
responses
le
actually
français?
shifted
Je
more
fais
toward
je dis
English
ça
and away from
en portrait
French?
général à travers le
I'm just trying to
Canada,
get
le
the
Québec, les autres
sort of
provinces.
the overview of
Il
what's
semble y avoir
happening
un
in
peu
Quebec and in the other provinces.
les réponses uniques semblent avoir un penchant plus vers l'anglais que le français. Est-ce que j'ai raison de dire ça?
It seems to be that there is a shift away from French toward English. Is that true? Answer. Well, if you look at Quebec, for example, there's been an increase in the use of English as the main language of work in the workplace. So it's true that this is a trend that we've seen here and elsewhere in the country. But part of that increase might explain by the way people answer the question. If they previously said, well, we speak both languages at work, and now they're just citing one language, that might partly explain the change. And what we observed for French in Quebec is that there is a relative stability, but we could also interpret this as being a small decline in French. Because the people who use French as their primary language at work might have answered, that they used both English and French in the past. So this could be interpreted as a small decline, and this may be due to the way the question was asked. There may be other factors too, and of course there are differences across regions. I would also mention that when you consider the previous census and this census, often it was a very small percentage of the population that said that they used both English and French. And that is something we have to take into account when we're interpreting the difference between the two censuses.
OK. Et en sous-question, je veux vous amener concernant l'instruction de la
And
langue
as a
nouvelle
follow-up
Je sais que c'est la
question,
première fois qu'on a des données.
on the
mais
language
je
of
remarque
instruction, I know this is the first time we have
en
data
tant
on
que
this.
statisticien, quelle lecture vous en faites? Là, je pense que c'est 22 ou 23%, près d'un quart des
I
enfants
think you
qui
said
sont
22
admissibles
or
qui ne vont pas à l'école
23%
en
of
français.
children who are eligible for this minority
Quelle
language
lecture vous
instruction
en
don't
faites? Puis pour
actually
vous, est-ce
get
que
it.
ça veut dire
So
que ce
how do you interpret
23%-là,
that? Does that mean that the
ce sont des personnes qui
23%,
plus tard dans la vie vont seulement parler en anglais?
will end up speaking English later in life or only English? Answer. It's a very good question. The census will allow us to have some data for the first time to see what proportion of those who are eligible for minority language instruction actually end up getting it. And, we see that 2/3 of those eligible have received some instruction and a third have not. So it's important to know that the 2021 census did not ask for the reasons why people did or did not receive official language minority instruction. One possibility is parental choice. In other cases, it might be that the family lives too far from the school. That absolutely could be a factor, and we've provided information today about the number of children who are eligible. And if you look at the schools, you can see that 90% of the students who are eligible live less than 15 kilometers away from a school that provides that linguistic minority instruction. And we are currently conducting a survey that has follow-up questions, more detailed questions about English language instruction in Quebec and French outside of Quebec. And in that survey, we ask specific questions about the reasons why parents may have decided to send their children to these minority language schools or not. And for the children who were too young to have started school, so children under 5, we have also asked if the parents intend to send them or register them in an official language minority school. So all of that data will add to our understanding of this phenomenon. And when we have the results of that study in 2024, we will be able to provide more information about to what we already know from the census. It is a very important bit of information. This is the first time that we have such a detailed database, and there are going to be a lot of analyses that can be done in the future. You referred to a possible relationship between having this minority instruction early in life and then using it at work later in life. I think that's an analysis that could be done later on. This is really just the beginning of the process right now, and there will be more data to come. I see that we have a request for a follow-up clarification from Émilie Bergeron, but before we go to her, I just want to give people who haven't had an opportunity to ask a question yet to do so.
Are there any other people who have not asked a question yet on Zoom who would like to ask one? Please use the raise hand function. Bon, alors on va terminer avec Émilie Bergeron.
All right, so we'll finish with Émilie Bergeron.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you.
J'avais une demande de précision pour Monsieur Caron-Malenfant.
I wanted a clarification from Mr. Caron-Malenfant. With the data that's come out today about the use of French in the workplace in Quebec, will that data allow us to draw any conclusions about the integration of new immigrants arriving in Quebec, who arrived in Quebec between 2016 and 2021? Answer. That's a good question. There are a lot of tables and graphs available on the website that cross-reference information about language of work and immigration status and other characteristics. For example, the amount of time since a person immigrated to Canada. Because often the immigrants who have been here longer are more likely to use the majority language wherever they are at work. Now, your question was specifically about Quebec, I believe. Is that right?
Oui, désolée, j'étais sur Zoom,
Yes,
mais
sorry, I
oui,
was
c'est
on
pour,
mute, but yes.
oui, en milieu de travail au Québec.
Oui, c'est ça. Ben, au Québec ou à Montréal, en fait, de ce qu'on
So,
voit,
yes, in Quebec and in Montreal, what we've seen
parmi les travailleurs qui, à la maison, utilisent
is that if you look at workers who use a different language at home, so who speak a language other than French or English at home,
se concentre la plus grande part de la population qui utilise
and
une
this
langue
is
autre que
primarily
le français
around
à la maison.
Montreal,
Ce qu'on voit, c'est qu'environ la moitié
we've seen that around
utilisaient le
half of
français
them
comme langue
use French as their main language at work,
tiers
and
utilisaient
about a
l'anglais
third use English as their main language at work.
Donc voilà.
So that's something for you. Great. I have another question for a follow-up from Pascal Vachon, and then one other
Merci. Juste une
journalist.
dernière précision.
Yep, thank you.
Dans le fond, j'ai deux petites sous-questions. Vous
So I
avez
have two
un encadrement là,
sub-questions.
qui dit les secteurs où sont concernés, je pense dans la région de
You
Montréal,
talk
par
about
exemple.
sectors
Mon collègue a posé
in
une question tantôt.
Montreal,
Peut-être ça pourrait arriver plus tard, mais juste une question de précision.
and I
Est-ce
just
que
want a
tout ce qui est
clarification.
transporteur aérien, là, notamment,
If it comes to like
que ce soit les
airlines,
transporteurs publics, là, que ce soit les trains, les avions, tout ça,
trains,
j'aimerais
and
savoir,
so
est-ce que
on,
ça rentre dans la catégorie administration
would that
publique?
fall into the
C'est plus
category
une
of public
sensibilité
administration
à la loi sur la
because
langue officielle au niveau
they're
fédéral.
subject, because they're federally regulated?
Ma deuxième sous-question,
And my second sub-question,
on voit qu'il y a une baisse dans la région d'Ottawa.
we've
Gatineau.
seen
Ma
a
question,
drop
c'est est-ce
in
que ça peut
Ottawa-Gatineau.
sous-entendre qu'il y a une
So
baisse au niveau de l'utilisation du français
a drop in the
dans
use
la
of
région
French, I should
d'Ottawa-Gatineau? Est-ce que ça
say.
peut sous-entendre qu'il y a une
Does that
baisse du français dans la
imply
fonction publique
that there's
fédérale
a drop
s'il y
in
a
the
une
use of
baisse dans la
French in
région?
the federal public service?
Merci pour la
Answer.
question, pour les deux questions.
Thank you for the
En fait,
question,
la
or for those
première,
two
au niveau
questions.
du transport aérien,
Now, in terms of the
transport aérien
airline
dans
industry,
public,
does that fall under public administration? I believe not, but I might confirm with my colleague.
No, that air transport and trains fall under the transportation and warehousing industry. Public administration is, federal, provincial, and municipal and territorial administration of public admin.
Merci. Donc voilà.
Thank you. So, yes, so the answer is no, it does not fall under public administration. And then in terms of your second follow-up question about Ottawa-Gatineau, I mean, I think you were referring actually to Gatineau specifically. We have seen a slight decrease in the use of French. And that's something that we had observed when we published information this summer on the primary language of work, the primary language spoken at home. The Outaouais is one of the regions of Quebec where we see a really high percentage of people using English, compared to Quebec as a whole. So the Pontiac region and Gatineau, notably.
Donc, excusez-moi, juste pour préciser, donc est-ce qu'on
Sorry,
peut
just a
sous-entendre
clarification
une
again.
baisse dans la
Does that
fonction publique
imply that there is a
fédérale ou
drop
nous
in the use of French in the federal public service?
Donc, pour la
Yes, sorry, I had
fonction
forgotten to answer that part of the question. I don't have the data for the federal public service, but I could follow up with you just after the press conference if you'd like. And I should be able to find you those numbers.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Désolé pour les nombreuses questions.
Thanks, and sorry for all the questions.
On encourage les questions.
Valerie. So in the document, you talk about the rate of overqualification. You say it's twice as high among immigrants as among the population as a whole, or among Canadians born here. What accounts for that significant gap?
to Catherine. Yes.
So specifically, the rate of overqualification for immigrants who have a bachelor's degree or higher from outside Canada is twice as high as among either the Canadian-born or immigrants with a Canadian degree. So really, what's driving that difference is the fact of having a foreign degree. It's not for immigrants who have a Canadian degree, their overqualification rates are quite similar to those of Canadian-born degree holders. Statistics Canada doesn't provide specific information on barriers that foreign educated immigrants may face or on things like credential recognition and degree of, like the exact degree of fluency in official languages. But we can say that in terms of job mismatch, which is a slightly different concept from overqualification, you do see for foreign educated immigrants, even when they've got degrees in fields that are very highly in demand, like nursing or as doctors, around 4 in 10 people with foreign nursing or medical immigrants with foreign nursing or medical degrees are working as nurses or doctors respectively, compared to about 9 in 10 of all those with Canadian degrees in those fields. So for immigrants, you do see a very clear distinction in terms of overqualification rates between those with a foreign education and those with a degree from in Canada.
Et qu'est-ce qui explique qu'on soit en tête du palmarès du G7?
And what explains the fact that we're at the top of the G7 ranking?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. So what really explains the fact that we're at the top of G7 countries in terms of this, you know, it's really the role of the college and university sector. We know that 1/3 of working age Canadians had a bachelor's degree or higher, and that is an increase, in fact, a faster increase relative to the previous census. And the other thing I wanted to say is that we also know that there are 1 million people, working age people, who have a bachelor's degree or higher, which partly accounts for the fact that we're at the top of the G7 rankings. And half of that increase was attributable to recent immigrants, who generally have a higher level of education than in the past. Question. So, despite all this, if I've understood correctly, I believe you said that we're going to continue to see a decline until 2030. 2036. So, how long will immigration continue to mitigate the situation? Okay, so here you're talking about employment rates, is that right? Yes. So again, the important thing here is that we are giving an overview of the situation from May 2021. So an overview of important things like employment, the labor force, and so on. Immigration is part of the solution, but we also need to look at other possibilities, other possible explanations, whether those may be, you know, skills and development programs, particular groups within the population who are participating more in the labor force, older people, 55 and up, who are continuing to work, and so on. So there's not a single explanation here. There's a combination of factors. And, you know, a combination of things that we need to do to maintain high employment rates in Canada. Thank you. Thank you very much. This ends the press conference. Thank you very much for your time, for your explanations today. Have a good day.